Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Truth About Bees event. Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Christina Cardona, and I'm the CBC co-director. It is my privilege to share this virtual and in-person space with y'all. I would like to begin with the CCBC's acknowledgement of the People's Statement. The Community College of Baltimore County wishes to acknowledge the indigenous peoples whose homeland is now Baltimore County. The lands upon which these campuses are built were once inhabited by the Accohanock, Accokeek, Assateague, Choptank, Conoy, Lenape, Mattapique, Mattawoman, Nanticoke, Osing, Patuxent, Piscataway, Powhatan, Susquehannock, and Yaucoyoko people. The Community College of Baltimore County not only recognizes and honors the history and legacy of these people, but also the Native communities who have made Baltimore their home, most especially the Lumbee and the Cherokee, who have made rich contributions to the region. The Community Book Connection is a faculty-led interdisciplinary reading initiative dedicated to promote a culture of discussion and debate at CCBC. Each year, students, faculty, and staff vote on a book and a theme that we will use for the following academic year. We then collaborate to develop curriculum, programming, and events related to the book's theme that aim to create community conversations, and transformative experiences. This year's book is The Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd. As related to this book, we have a topic today on the truth about bees. And we have Francis Mullan, who is an entomologist, educator, and naturalist. He holds a bachelor's degree in insect ecology and conservation from the University of Delaware and a master's degree in integrative biology from Kennesaw State University. For his master's thesis, he conducted research on the effects of climate change and urbanization on various bee species. He has previously worked for the USDA, the Natural Wildlife Federation, and the USGS Bee Inventory Monitoring Lab in Laurel, Maryland. His greatest passion is opening people's eyes to the beauty and wonder of biodiversity, especially as it presents itself through insects, thus allowing people to enrich their lives through a new understanding and admiration for the natural world. Welcome.
Thank you. So I should be in the frame now, so right? So. Hi, thank you for the introduction, and hi to everybody on Zoom, which I think is most of the people on the presentation today. I'm excited to be here and tell you all the truth about bees. Just the title of the book would work for this well, The Secret Life of Bees, but this is from the scientific perspective of that. So yeah, as Dr. Cardona alluded to, I really became fascinated with native bees during my studies in undergraduate and graduate school, and figured out that I wanted everybody to get to understand this group of creatures much better because they're so critical for our environments. So now I've wanted to, through my career, explain the importance of this form of diversity in our world, as well as biodiversity in general, not only because it's so critical for the health of our environment, but because I think there's really a lot of joy and fulfillment that actually can come with connecting with biodiversity. And sadly, most people have a really extremely limited knowledge of this because our society just doesn't really teach what the full extent of it is, in typical schooling. So I hope to fill a bit of a gap there and expand people's knowledge on that so that they can connect with it more deeply and understand what I think is really the most amazing thing about our planet, the world we live in. So I guess I'd like you all to keep something in the back of your mind a little bit as we go through this presentation, which is just that everything I hopefully blow your mind about with bees is just the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about like the true nature of biodiversity and how deep it really goes in our world. So for those who choose to explore it, there is endless wonders to find in the world around us. Bees are just the start of that. So, so let's get into it. By the way, for anybody here or anybody watching on Zoom, if you're curious or confused why this thing on the screen, which presumably would be a bee, is green, all will soon be revealed. It is a real bee. It's not some weird AI image or something. So, but yeah, you'll find out soon. So I like to start this presentation by orienting ourselves, giving some baseline about what people already know about bees, which is typically related to the most famous bees of all. If I can pass the slide. Uh-oh.
Oh, just press on the screen and then.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. There we go. Honeybees. Pretty sure everybody in the world is familiar with these. And I think most people, I have some pictures to jog some memory, but we all know, the thing about bees live in hives. There's a queen worker dynamic monarchy going on. They work cooperatively. There's many thousands of them that live together in a hive. They make honey, obviously, along with wax and this amazing hexagonal honeycomb structure. All this stuff has been, written about in so many different stories and books in our culture because it's amazing. So everybody loves honeybees. Most people, I think, like honey. If they don't, maybe that's a little weird, but we understand that opinion. Anyway, going forward, throw all that out the window because it's actually not relevant for what we're talking about here today. Not really. The reason for that is because all of those things apply to really just one species, at least one species we have here in our part of the world, which is the honeybee. But honeybees are just one of many different types of bees. Most people have never heard of these different types of bees. If you'd like some examples, these might be mining bees, mason bees, sweat bees, bumblebees, nomad bees, resin bees, carpenter bees, small carpenter bees, longhorn bees, leafcutter bees, sharp-tailed bees, wool-carder bees, berry bees, goblin bees, orchid bees, stingless bees, vulture bees, cellophane bees, masked bees, digger bees, oil baron bees, alkali bees, squash bees, sunflower bees, neon cuckoo bees, and even more things that I could not fit into a single hour-long presentation, so I'm not going to do that. The point is that the world of bees is quite large. There's actually many different forms that these creatures take and many different lives they live, most of which look nothing at all like the lives that honeybees live. And actually most of these creatures, as you can see, don't even look like honeybees much at all, despite being bees. So if we want to understand bees as a whole, the truth about bees, who they are as a whole category of creatures, group of animals, you have to get rid of the frame of reference of honeybees, because everything you associate with honeybees does not apply to all the rest of the group of animals they are a part of. So going forward, we're gonna wipe the slate clean, maybe pretend that you know nothing about bees, and I will rebuild everyone's knowledge from the ground up, starting with the most basic of things, which is, what are bees anyway, if we have to put a definition to it? If you want to be really technical about it, bees are insects in the order Hymenoptera. Apologies for the Latin, but you kind of can't get away from that if you dive into this part of science. Basically, this is a group that comprises bees, wasps, ants, and a few other kinds of insects that are not relevant to this presentation, but basically it's a very large group of creatures which are all related to each other. It's an enormous group. There's over 100,000 described species of these creatures in the world. Bees are just one part of this giant family tree. A more precise definition of bees, something that some other bee people have come up with, is that bees are essentially a group of vegetarian wasps that eat plant pollen as a source of protein in order to complete their development. By the way, slight side note, bees being vegetarian wasps would imply that most other wasps are carnivorous. And I won't talk about wasps really today because that's its own gigantic topic, which I don't have time to dive into, but I do a lot of defense of wasps in my career. And the fact that they are carnivorous and eat a lot of other things that would cause much destruction of human and such is why wasps are actually very important. So really bees and wasps both have their role to play in the environment and both benefit humanity despite what some people might think. So, but anyway, we can talk more about that at the end if people are curious. So anyway, bees are on this part of the family tree. If you were to zoom into that, here's the closest relatives to bees, and bees sit at the bottom there, being one of the more recently evolved groups. As you can see, they're closely related to ants and some other maybe familiar things. Bees evolved about 125 million years ago, which is about the same time that flowering plants evolved. So their diversity exploded along with the diversity of flowering plants, of which, by the way, there's about 300,000 species in the world as of now. So plenty of diversity to learn there too. But anyway, the bees now, their life strategy in collecting pollen from all these different kinds of flowering plants was so successful that they've now diversified into about 20,000 species of their own across the world, of which we have about 4,000 just in our own country. And by the way, in our beautiful state of Maryland, we've got about 400. So plenty of diversity already there to wrap your head around, much less, thinking of 4,000 different types of these things. But yeah, as you can see, just within our own state, the diversity looks pretty amazing. So that's what bees are like, definitionally. I think maybe the next good question to answer is, what do they look like? How would you recognize bees? The thing is that actually bees, for one thing, you can't recognize them really by color alone because they come in quite literally every color of the rainbow. Most species are not like really bright metallic colors, at least where we live in this part of the world, but still there's a good diversity there. So they do tend to have a similar body plan, as you can see here, with being maybe kind of chunky and having a good amount of hair, but actually their hairiness varies quite a bit. And some bees are really slender while other ones are kind of like little mini bears, or, things that look like they're fattening up for the winter. So that's, you can't go just by body shape alone exactly either. Bees also come in a pretty stark diversity of sizes. I used to work in a museum that had a large bee collection, and I was amazed by this. The bee on the left is a specimen of the largest carpenter bee in the United States. Actually, it is the largest bee species in our country, which is carpenter bee from the West Coast. And the little orange speck on the right is something called a fairy bee, which is the smallest species of bee in the world, actually, not just our country. It's from Arizona, so if you ever go there, be on the lookout for that. You would be lucky if you actually see it, but it exists. Where do bees live? Most of the time, in a hole in the ground, like this. You actually might step over their home and not even realize it. If you had like X-ray vision and could peer into this would probably be about what you see. A ground nest with a bunch of different side tunnels, sort of a simple arrangement. The female bee, for most species, will do all the work in creating a nest like this. But basically, she'll put a little egg at the end of each of those side tunnels, along with pollen and nectar that she's gathered all by herself, so that her baby can eat in peace. And then she'll barricade that off to prevent any predators from getting in. And about a year later, her bee baby will have metamorphosed into a beautiful adult bee, and we'll repeat that whole cycle. That's been going on for about 125 million years now. So about 70% of all bees nest essentially in this way, in the ground. The other 30% of bees nest in a variety of ways. A bunch nest like in soft wood that they can chew into and make tunnels in. Some other bees are so tiny they can actually fit inside of plant stems. They'll like maybe take out the pith of the stem and then just use that hollow tunnel to put a bunch of eggs into. And so then some other bees will use things like cavities in trees or bird boxes if they get the chance. So like some bumblebees do. Are bees important? Everybody knows the answer to this, but just to clarify, yes, very much so. The reason they are so important is because they are, along with other pollinators, directly responsible for the creation of these things, seeds, which are the carriers for plant reproduction. So bees and other pollinators directly facilitate plant reproduction, and because plants are the foundation for essentially every ecosystem on land on our planet, they perform a pretty important service. I guess selfishly, what humans care about maybe more than just this, and what many other animals care about, is what precedes the seeds, which are fruit. And in fact, actually, to put some more numbers to this, quite a lot of the fruits that we, and vegetables that we eat, are dependent upon pollinators. Here's just some examples: apples and melons, raspberries, a bunch of different kinds of nuts, and actually even things like chocolate and vanilla are derived from fruits that are pollinated by certain kinds of insects. So I'm glad that we have the bees and other things around. These are the 5 like big players in the pollinator world. There are birds and mammals that are pollinators as well, but the really big players are bees, wasps, beetles, flies, and butterflies, which altogether pollinate around 80% of all of the 300,000 species of flowering plants that exist across the planet. They aid in the pollination of around 75% of all the kinds of crops that we grow around the world. So maybe around 25% of crops are things like cereals, like wheat or rye, which are not dependent upon pollination. But for all the varieties of crops that we do eat, obviously give us a lot of important nutrients. So I think if pollinators were to die off, I don't know if we would be able to survive in a world that we only eat cereal or bread or things. So it's probably best that we try to preserve these creatures. This is the question that I know is burning in everybody's mind, which is what the heck is this green one? So finally, I will answer that. And actually, for the next several slides, I'm going to give you all a very quick crash course on what I think are the 10 like most common types of bees you'll see in the environment. So we'll go through these very quickly. There could be a lot more detail to cover about this, but I'll start with the group that this beautiful green thing belongs to, which are the sweat bees, which I think is a good group to start with because actually this is one of the most common families of native bees that we have in our environment. They come in a range of colors. Some are kind of black and not very conspicuous, but some are this amazing like metallic green color, like the one I have on the title slide. If you ever get to see those in the environment, they really a treat. They just stand out so much. These bees also kind of run the gamut in terms of how bees might live. One way is that they can either be what we call solitary, where essentially it's every female for herself, building her own nest. There's no queen she bows down to, no other workers that she works alongside of. It's just a one-woman operation, and it's her own eggs that she cares for all by her own. But some other kinds of sweat bees maybe have like a communal lifestyle where maybe they'll share a nest network, but they don't actually interact with each other. And even further yet, some might be social, albeit primitively. They don't have like a giant organization like honeybees would, but still there is like a queen who has maybe a few worker daughters and they get the work done that way. They will typically nest underground, like I showed you guys the graphic before. Some also nest above ground, like maybe in wood. And these bees are what we call generalists. They collect pollen from a huge diversity of flowering plants, which means that they are important pollinators for a huge diversity of flowering plants. Also, one fun feature about this group, aside from them bringing these amazing metallic colors, is that many are really, really small. But I have been tricked sometimes into thinking one was just a gnat or something until you get a close look at it. That top right picture is magnified probably like 10 times. One could land on you and you would not expect it to be a bee, maybe unless you have a bee nerd around to explain that to you. So this was a bee I was enamored with because she was one of the first native bees I got to hold. And for those on Zoom, I apologize if the video isn't coming through well. I think sometimes okay, hopefully it is, that's great. I have a few videos of the presentation to get to show some fun stuff, but anyway, this is what one of those metallic green bees looks like in real life on video. This is a female that was just coming out of the ground in spring. I found several years ago. And so she was a little groggy from sleeping for 8 months, so she was she let me hold her like this, and now I use her on all my presentations because well, she's pretty awesome. Who wouldn't? But anyway, another fun thing to look out for, by the way, about these bees in our environment. These are a couple that I found within the last year. They're called bright green sweat bees, but actually they can be gold or even like this beautiful ruby red color. So they're really just a wonderful group of critters if you start paying attention to them to see those colors in the environment. By the way, they're called sweat bees because they like to drink sweat. As odd as that might sound. Bees and other insects need sodium in their diet, just like we do. For whatever reason, sweat bees seem to need a lot of sodium, and they've evolved alongside some, I think, sorts of mammals that might sweat a lot to get that sodium source. Humans sweat quite a lot, so they love us in summer when we tend to be sweating buckets. If you ever see a sweat bee land on you to drink your sweat, don't panic. She's not going to hurt you. She just wants your sweat, and then we'll move on quickly. So they only ever sting in self-defense if they absolutely have to. So they're not trying to screw up anybody's day by doing this. By the way, again, sweat bees are not the only kind of bees that need sodium or occasionally drink sweat. This has only happened to me once, but this was a carpenter bee that decided to land on my arm and drink my sweat for some reason a couple years ago. And the video is only 5 seconds long, but she was on my arm for like a minute, which I find funny. I don't know. I guess she was just very thirsty. So hopefully she got her fill. Anyway, speaking of carpenter bees, we'll talk about that group next. I'm sure most people have heard of carpenter bees, but hopefully I can give you some details you didn't know about. They are cousins to honeybees. However, they are quite different in terms of their lifestyle. They are solitary or communal. So again, it's like typically either every female for herself. There is no queen that they're beholden to, or they might create a nest and then share an entrance, but it's like an apartment complex. They don't talk to their neighbors to do their own thing. So they make nests in wood, really pretty elaborate nests, like what you can see in the top right photo, with all these different galleries and divisions to protect each of their eggs. And unfortunately, this can be a nuisance for us humans because they sometimes will use wood in the structures that we build. But they are important pollinators, being generalists like sweat bees, so they collect pollen from a huge diversity of plants, and they're pretty big and hairy, so they do a pretty good job at doing that. So we do need them around. But sometimes we may need to manage them carefully. Also, carpenter bees are, I think, a great example to tell sexes between bees, because they display a trend that's common across the bee world, but it's especially apparent for them since they are such big bees. This is an easy thing to look out for once you see it. So I'll let the audience, if anybody doesn't know which is which, I'll let you think for 5 seconds which one you might think it is, and then I will reveal the answer here. Do you think the left one is female or the right one is female? If you thought the left one was female, you were correct. So the way you can tell is that the males have this bright white face patch, which again, once you know that it's there, it's pretty obvious. But again, this is indicative of a larger trend in the bee world, which I like to refer to as males wear makeup, where several different, for a lot of species of bees, the males have these bright white faces, which are painted in various patterns. So not all the time, disclaimer, there are many exceptions to this, but for many groups, this holds true. And I think it's quite cute. They look very pretty, I think. So I hope they feel good about themselves. Going off from carpenter bees, I think it's important to talk about small carpenter bees, which as a group I find just about nobody's heard of, but they are very common. I see them all the time on flowering plants. They're just so small that I think people probably often assume they're flies or gnats or something and don't realize that they actually are true bees pollinating just like all the other kinds of bees do. You can see in the top left photo a size comparison between like a typical carpenter bee and the small carpenter bees, which are their cousins. Quite the size difference. These bees they do basically the exact same thing their larger cousins do. The big difference is that they are small enough to actually use plant stems as their nests. They don't have to chew a giant hole into like a huge log to make their nest out of. They just choose a hollow stem or make the stem hollow by hollowing it out themselves, and then use that tube to lay a whole bunch of eggs into. So it's a pretty efficient nesting strategy. And they tend to be these really nice, like deep metallic colors, which if you could like zoom in on one with a magnifying glass or a good camera, they're really beautiful. And this is one I found this past year, which was sleeping. And I thought this is just really adorable because this little male carpenter bee had his head resting against the pistil of this flower, which to me was reminiscent of if you fell asleep like with your head against a wall, if you maybe were working too hard during the day and then just collapsed wherever you were. You will often find bees sleeping like this. They tuck themselves out during the day, so they just plop down wherever they are. Sometimes you'll see bees sleeping like this, though. They might choose a more hidden spot, and they can do this amazing thing where they will lock their mandibles, their jaws, onto like a plant stem or a leaf, and then kind of just freeze their whole body. And they will spend the night like that at this bizarre angle, hanging off a leaf or something. And when the morning comes, they kind of loosely unlock themselves and are on their way. And occasionally you'll find a bee slumber party of a whole bunch of males doing this together, which is my favorite aspect of all of this. So I haven't seen this in the wild really myself yet, but there's a few species in some parts of the country that are known to do this. So something to be on the lookout for. Safety in numbers, I think, as a lot of animals do. Yes. Yeah. Pretty sure everybody's heard of bumblebees. Although in my work as an educator, I found there's a lot of confusion about bumblebees and what the differences are between them and some related species. So I'm here to clear that up. One thing that's special about bumblebees compared to the vast majority of kinds of bees is that they're what we call obligately social. So they only ever exist as a social unit of creatures. There's a single time per year where a queen bee to be would be on her own before she's established a nest. But assuming she survives the winter and goes on, she will create a nest always and has workers and makes that whole operation. So they typically nest underground. They will use like a abandoned nest from a mammal, like a rodent of some kind often. Some nest above ground though. And they are for sure some of our most important pollinators because one thing, they're just so dang hairy, they carry on to a whole lot of pollen, but they're very industrious workers because they have a whole bunch of baby bees to feed. As you can see in the bottom right photo, that's what a typical bumblebee nest looks like. And it is kind of a chaotic mess, but there's a whole lot of eggs hidden in there. So all the worker bees work all day to collect as much pollen as they can to feed to all the sweet little bee babies. And also, I think bumblebees are a great gateway for getting into bee watching, which you could, if you are into bird watching, you could get into bee watching too. Turns out that you can learn to identify a whole bunch of different species of bees by learning their color patterns. This is very much true for bumblebees, which have some pretty distinctive patterns. This is a graph showing you the diversity across like the southeastern United States. So we don't have all these species in Maryland, but we have several of them. I see several of them, all the time trading places throughout the year here right between like DC and Baltimore. So something fun to look out for in case you're looking for a new hobby, just to encourage anybody on that. Also, I had to clear this up a lot, how you can tell between a bumblebee and a carpenter bee. in case anybody you can take your guesses now, but if you thought that the top bee was a bumblebee, you're correct. And there's a helpful adage to remember here for telling the two apart, which is that carpenter bees have a shiny hiney. So the abdomen on carpenter bees is essentially devoid of hair, which means it reflects a lot of sunlight. It's shiny. Bumblebees have a fully hairy butt. You're not going to see any sun reflected off that. So that's the easy way you can tell. This is one of my favorite groups. These are cousins to bumblebees and carpenter bees, though a bit smaller, and one that I think most people have never heard of. So I am glad to get to hopefully introduce them to a lot of you today. These are the longhorn bees, which are so called because the males have these extraordinarily long antennae, which you can see like in the top right photo there. They are all solitary. The females, instead of having these huge antennae, have these giant oversized hind legs for carrying just a ton of pollen, which we in the bee science world like to call pollen pants. So they're both adorable in their own way, I think. And some are important specialists. I've been talking about generalist bees this whole time, but this is the first group where you get some specialists in. So these are bees that only visit certain kinds of flowers. So for example, there's a few species of longhorn bees that are called squash bees. They visit what you'd expect. Some other are sunflower bees or other related things. And because they only visit those plants, they're very important pollinators for those plants that their lives are tied to. This was a longhorn bee I found a few years ago, who I was lucky I managed to catch him in the act of grooming his antenna, which, you know, they have actually insects, basically all insects groom themselves, if you didn't know. But the ones that tend to have these really oversized body parts have to do it more often than usual because, you know, well, it's this giant thing they got flailing around and they got to keep it clean. They use the antenna, the males do, to catch on to the scent of females. So he has to make sure that they are in proper working order. And also the females, this is just a fun thing I love about this group, tend to have these like gemstone-like eyes that are really gorgeous. Again, if you can see them at high magnification, but I think even if you just catch one in the sun just for a moment, you might spot that. They really are just lovely things. All right, leafcutter bees. I find some people have heard of this group, but I think still most have not. So these guys tend to be more monochromatic, not as much color diversity, but you know, they're still striking in their own way. Their name is an allusion to the fact that they cut leaves to make their nests, go figure. It's actually really impressive. They'll cut all these little like half circles from plant leaves and then carry them back to a tunnel nest, often in wood. And then they'll precisely layer these leaves to make what some other people have termed leaf burritos, which are these little like packs you see on the left there, which have many layers all glued together. And they'll put an egg inside each one of those with a ball of pollen and nectar for the baby bee to get to feed on in peace. And they will stack as many of those as they can into a tunnel. And a female will do that as many times as she can through her life to try to secure her legacy. Another, also, if you are doing some bee watching, hopefully I've inspired some of you. One way to quickly recognize these bees in the field, or at least members of their family, is that they carry pollen on their abdomen instead of their legs. Most bees carry pollen on their hind legs, but these bees will get this enormous pollen butt after they've spent a whole day working. So that's pretty identifiable. And another characteristic for several species, the males have these ridiculous, like oversized mittens for front legs, which I think are pretty fun to look at. And it's a part of their mating ritual. I won't get too into that, but anyway, yeah, another thing to look for. All right, down to the last few groups here. Mining bees, which are one of the species that we will most often see in spring. I meant not the most visually interesting group, but they're very common and super important pollinators for a lot of our native plants that are, you know, critical to our environment. So they certainly deserve a spot in the spotlight here. They all nest underground, which is what the name is alluding to. And again, many are specialists. There's one that's particularly loved within the bee community, which is this thing called the spring beauty miner. If you didn't know, we have this wonderful little native wildflower in the eastern United States called the Virginia spring beauty, which is what that bottom left photo is showing. And there's a mining bee who only collects pollen from that flower. Her whole life is tied to that species of plant. So if you see the flower, you're basically bound to see the bee foraging from it at some point. And they get these hot pink pollen loads, which is pretty awesome. So my favorite feature about this group, though, is that the males often have these just amazing, luxuriant mustaches on their faces. This is a male I caught to show that off a few years ago. It's like one of those like 1800s style, like, you know, broom head mustaches kind of just plastered on there. I think it's pretty awesome. I don't know why they have that, by the way. They just do. It's a fun thing about the group. All right, we're getting weirder and weirder, by the way, in terms of the groups as we go along. So as I think this is the third to last one I'm talking about, and these ones are very strange. These are the masked bees, which again, actually very common, especially in like late summer and fall. I've seen tons of them. But they tend to be hairless, which seems bizarre. We're talking about bees, and these really striking colors all over the faces. They secrete this cellophane-like substance that they wrap their baby eggs in to protect them, which is kind of an amazing feature. Yeah, they also carry pollen internally. So I don't know, they do their own thing. They're very strange, but again, they're important pollinators like all the rest. Okay, second to last group. Another very strange one are the cuckoo bees. Actually, wait a minute. I have a few more photos here. So, cuckoo bees, of which there's several types. These are bees that are actually thieves, parasites of other bees, which are surprisingly common in some places. They don't make their own nests at all, and they actually don't collect pollen. They take it all from other bees, which might make it seem like they'd be, you know, bad for bee health, but actually these things can only survive when there's a healthy host population for them to parasitize, and they never seem to overtake the hosts. So if you see these in the environment, it means that the bee community is quite strong in that area. So they act as what we would call a bio-indicator of healthy host populations. So, and they look pretty cool, I think. Some also look remarkably like yellow jackets and other sorts of wasps, as indicated by this one. And many others are just kind of like matte black. Here's two of my favorite photos I've taken in the last year of a sharp-tailed cuckoo bee and a longhorn cuckoo bee on the right, which often can't sting for whatever reason. That's just some types of bees can't really sting, even though they actually have a stinger. It's a mystery to me why that is, to be honest, but I've sort of learned through reading about it or trial and error which ones can't do that. You can hold them for a photo, which is kind of fun. So, also, by the way, if you're noticing, the eyes have these amazing little patterns printed on them sometimes for bees. These are called pseudopupils. They're not pupils like ours. It's basically a factor of light refraction in the eye, because the compound eye of insects is so complicated with all these little facets. So I'm not a physicist, so I won't really explain more on exactly how that works. But if you're curious about what's going on there, here's the explanation. Okay, and the last group of all, which in my opinion is the most bizarre, are the honeybees. Ironically, honeybees are the only group that most people really know about, but they are very strange compared to all other sorts of bees. And I won't get into all the details of this because it's its own big topic to talk about. But there's actually only one species of these here, which is the European honeybee. It was brought over from Europe about 400 years ago by colonists across the Atlantic. There are no native honeybees in the United States or Canada. They really function as like an agricultural animal by this point. They're important for our agricultural system, but they don't really have a place in the native environment, which Unfortunately, there's some issues with that because they're here en masse now, but again, that's its own big topic, which I won't get into too much now. But anyway, just to drive home this point that again, most people when they think about bees associate like the hive and queens and workers and honey and honeycomb and all that stuff, and that really only applies to this group. Everything I just talked about, all the other sorts of bees don't share those same characteristics. So, all right. So yeah, that's a lot about bees, and I hope you all have been inspired to want to learn more about. Oh, I forgot about something. I think this question's on a lot of people's minds, which I figure I probably should address. Yeah, bees are in trouble, unfortunately. Actually, like most insects in the world now. Media is often focused about honeybee declines, and while there have been declines in honeybees, I and many conservationists would argue that actually we really should not be worried about honeybees. They're really not in any danger because they are a species that are directly managed by our own. They're semi-domestic. They're essentially livestock, like chickens and cows. So in the same way that I think most people aren't worried about chickens and cows going extinct, we shouldn't really be worried about honeybees going extinct. The creatures that, or the bees rather, that are in trouble are many of the natives, particularly bumblebees, of which about a quarter of our species in North America are threatened with extinction. This particular species called the rusty-patched bumblebee has kind of been the poster child for this movement because it was once common across our area as well as like the whole mid-Atlantic and Northeast, and sadly now has been essentially extirpated from much of its range. If you live in some areas of the Midwest, you might still see this bee, but you can't see it here in our part of Maryland anymore. So the reason for all these declines is unfortunately not just one. It'd be easier to solve it if there was one issue to solve, but there's a whole bunch of them. Climate change and pesticides and invasive species play a role, but the one that I'm trying to answer most through my career is the issue of habitat loss. And actually, I was studying in the Sustainable Horticulture Department here at CCBC to learn more about how to address this issue. Because in most of our human-made landscapes, we have left no habitat for bees. There are none of the plants that they evolved with which they need pollen from, and there's not really much space for them to nest in. So I think anybody could see how that would be a big issue for the environment. So in short, there's an easy way to solve this, thankfully, which is that we should try to have less spaces that look like this in our environment and create more spaces that look something like this, which are bursting with life of native plants, which provide lots and lots of food and habitat for not just bees, but so much of our native wildlife. And of course, biodiversity is the lifeblood of our environment, so it's something we need to preserve. And I mean, I think these spaces are beautiful, so we want to have them around anyway, in my opinion. Now, I'm going to go through this very quickly, but in case anybody's curious about this, and in fact, I could actually share some links maybe with the event organizers who could share these links with everybody who's attending today. But the Maryland Native Plant Society has put together a helpful list about nurseries in the region that sell native plants. Native plants, unfortunately, are not typically sold at, well, typical retail nurseries. You often have to go to special nurseries to get them. But it's a growing industry, so there are more and more popping up, and there are several well-established ones in the state now. So you could find which one's closest to you if you'd like to get some. There's many different kinds of native plants, but luckily some of the major conservation organizations in the country have already done the hard work of helping you pick out which ones you should get. I'll particularly point out there's a list by the National Wildlife Federation, which again is available online. If you just Google National Wildlife Federation native plants list, you'll find this, but again, we can share the link so everybody could have that. And the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has also put out their own list. So both those lists complement each other. There's a lot of good suggestions there. And most of these things you could find in most of these native plant nurseries if you'd like to plant them. So, but remember, bees don't just need food, they need shelter too. Native plants sometimes provide shelter just by having stems, which again, many bees will nest in the stems, but many native bees also nest in the ground. So if you leave some bare areas, or at least not like, completely flooded with grass areas of your yard, that'll be useful to ground nesting bees who, are critical pollinators for the environment. So I encourage you to do that. And another thing I can maybe share later, we don't have much time to go through the details of this, but there are methods that are recommended by conservation organizations for how you can manage the stems you have on plants that you plant to create this like stem nesting bee habitat, and just have a continually renewing supply of stems every year, because these are perennial plants that come back every single year, and you would never have to buy stems to help the bees nest in. Just let nature do its thing. Although, if any of you have heard of bee hotels, that's another way to solve this issue, which are fun. They make a great like garden accent piece. One thing that's super critical though is that you have to clean them, or better yet, just replace the stems inside of them to make sure that they're clean every single year. So if you don't clean them, then they can harbor pathogens, parasites, and other nasty things, which could infect the poor bees that are nesting inside, and that would be, well, not good for anybody, much less bees. So, all right, and if I've inspired you all to learn more, there's lots of awesome resources online for this stuff, and great books. This one in the center is like an awesome coffee table book, Bees in Your Backyard, just tons of amazing photos that show the diversity of bees much more thoroughly than I did today. And there's this fantastic PBS documentary, which is available free online if you Google the title of that, which I'd recommend anybody to watch. It's only like 50 minutes long, but it just has some unbelievable shots of bees going about their life, like in slow motion and super zoomed in. I am quite confident it'll blow your mind. It blew my mind as a bee scientist, so I feel like that's a good, high praise. Yeah. Also, shameless self-promotion, but I do a lot of my own educational content online, with sharing my photography and info about the creatures I find in the wild. So if you'd be curious to see more of me doing that, you can follow me along here. And also photo credits, a lot of great photographers who do all this stuff, which I'm grateful to. And that's it. So if we have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
We had a question on the chat from the honey bee slide.
Mhm.
Is that first picture for the honeybees, the eye of the bee
yes.
coming out of it?
Yeah. So one of the many weird things about honeybees is that they actually do have hair growing out of their eyes, which is this bizarre feature. My understanding is that it's an adaptation. The hairs are connected to nerves, which give them a more advanced navigational bees. So they exist in this huge social unit, thousands and thousands of workers in a hive with a bajillion bee baby mouths to feed. So they are especially industrious with looking for pollen in the environment. So they fly further than most species of bees to gather pollen. So it seems they've evolved some special traits to help them fly, especially far from the nest, and navigate around their environment to do all that. And again, as weird as it seems, one of these traits is hair growing out of their eyes that acts as this navigational tool when the wind is flowing past them. So
Does that help them judge the speed?
I think so. Yes. Yeah. As they're flying through the wind. So yeah.
What is your favorite bee?
I have probably a few favorites. Yeah, it's hard to pick just one. My favorite, I especially like queen bumblebees. Queen bumblebees have a special trait, which I forgot to touch on, which is that the queens are much larger than the workers. Again, they're one of the few kinds of bees where there actually is like a queen worker dynamic. But unlike honeybees, where the queen is essentially the same size as the workers, queen bumblebees are enormous. And you'll see them in early spring or the end of the year, where queens are either just starting their nest or have been born by the original queen and are leaving the nest to hibernate over the winter and will start their own nest the following spring. So I love seeing them in spring because they are harbingers for new life to come in that following year. But there's a lot of cool bees to choose from. There's a lot of good potential answers to that question. Yeah.
Do these bees mate in the air like the honeybees?
Um, uh, in my own observations, I've seen most bees made either on the ground or like on a flower. I don't think, yeah, it depends. I have seen bumblebees often made in midair. I mean, well, they might be flying joined together. They will often land though to do the deed more. So yeah, I think honeybees might be, it might be really more of a thing for them where they exclusively are mating in the air.
Another reasons the drones have great big eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's another strange thing about another interesting thing. This might answer a question that's already been asked too in the chat. For most species of bees, you will see males and females probably like about an equal proportion. Honeybees are another reason they're bizarre is that unless you are a beekeeper, you are extremely unlikely to ever see a male. Males basically only exist outside the hive for a short period of time when it is the mating season. Um, and they will, you know, fly around, mate in midair, and they actually die in the act of mating. But for other species of bees, males will forage on flowers and dash around the environment basically just as much as the females do. So, yeah.
Someone wrote here, I read that without bees, the colors of flowers would be mostly white, brown, and green. Can you share more about that relationship?
Without bees, the colors of flowers would be mostly white, brown, or green. Is that right? Interesting. I have not heard that actually. I could speculate on that. I mean, again, bees and flowers have co-evolved for many millions of years. And I don't know if anybody knows what the original flowers looked like exactly. I mean, but it would make sense to think they were much simpler than they are today. I it makes a lot of sense to me to think that definitely flower colors have gotten more extravagant over time and probably in conjunction with their relationship with bees. The whole topic of like specialization among certain bees for visiting kinds of flowers is an interesting concept. Kind of hard to explain, but you know, if you're thinking about life strategies, you could either be a generalist who is collecting from a whole bunch of different things, and that means that you're not ever reliant on just one type of flower. But it also means that pollen is not the easiest thing to digest. It has a bunch of different, you know, constituent parts. So you may need to collect a lot of pollen and then not even be able to use all the nutrients within it to just be able to properly digest it. And then, you know, complete your development. Specialists have evolved to be able to more efficiently digest the pollen that they are collecting. But you know, the plant is incentivized to keep the pollinator around because if it has a specialist bee that has this special relationship and is always visiting the flower, you want to get the most bang for your buck every time the bee comes around. So maybe the flower will evolve special colors to, you know, make sure it's drawing that bee in compared to the other flowers in its environment that it's competing with. So that's me and my speculation. But I'll have to look into that point. I actually haven't heard that exact thing. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Any more questions from the virtual group?
If there's no more questions, I will say a short thing about honeybees, just because I guess we have like 5 minutes, right? But if there is a question that comes in, I'll be happy to answer that. I like to touch on, just because with the whole like save the bees movement, beekeeping has become a big thing. I wonder, are there any beekeepers? Okay, I figured. It seems like you know a lot about honeybees. So yeah. So, you know, again, honeybees are amazing creatures, and our agricultural system has evolved alongside of them because they are pretty good pollinators for a lot of our like main crops. But again, they didn't evolve in North America and they didn't evolve with our native flora, our flowering plants. So they don't have a role within our native ecology here in North America. They can pollinate some of our native plants okay, but in most cases they don't really do that great of a job. There's a potential issue with honeybees, unfortunately, which is that if there's a ton of them in one area, then like invasive species do, you know, often certain plants are examples of this. If there's a lot of them in one area, they can actually outcompete the native bees. in that same area. And the honeybees obviously are not being malicious about this. You know, they care about their own survival, and they have a lot of bee mouths to feed back at their hive, so they are just, you know, doing their job as diligent moms. But the native bees never had to evolve with a bee like the honeybee, which has this enormous resource demand. So the native bees just can't really compete with that when there is that huge of a presence of the honeybees in a certain area. So all this is to say, I don't discourage beekeeping. If somebody wanted to start keeping bees for the express purpose of saving the bees, I would discourage them from that, because you're not really saving the bees by keeping honeybees. You should think of keeping honeybees as a hobby that is an awesome thing, and there's a lot of great products you can get out of it. And you know, you could give honey and honeycomb and wax to, you know, your community, which is an awesome resource. But it's something that I think should be done keeping the greater ecology in mind, you know, and you should be being responsible as a beekeeper by trying to minimize your operations so that you try to have your bees not outcompete the native bees. And also, you know, make sure your hives are clean so that you're not potentially having diseases spill over into the native bee population. So things like that. I think probably, well, the whole reason I'm doing this is because most people aren't aware that native bees even exist. So they wouldn't be aware of the problems that honeybees could cause for native bees. Now you all do know that native bees exist, and that there is this potential issue. So if anybody, you know, listening wants to get into honeybee keeping, that's fine. But, you know, I ask that you be aware of this, and again, just be responsible with it. So
One advantage I think of people who learn about them is that then they're encouraged to plant more flowers and plants.
Oh,
And that I think,
yes,
just like people want to protect polar bears, it also protects a lot of other things.
yes,
So
yeah.
having a lot more plants that you're thinking about the honeybees also provides more forage for lots.
Yeah, and actually, thank you very much for bringing that up. I usually say that, and I forgot to say that point, but that's probably the most important thing, is that one of the other aspects of being a responsible beekeeper is planting habitat for the bees. I mean, really for honeybees, it's planting food for them, which you should do by planting native flowering plants, which is because the native flowering plants will provide pollen and nectar that the honeybees are just fine using. And that same pollen and nectar will be ideal for the native bees as well. So
there's the native bees who are plant a variety of things, because the honeybees
right.
actually need
Yes.
a lot of one things, because they only go to one type of flower on any foraging trip. A lot of the some of the native bees go to multiple. So
yeah,
a lot of
well,
things that helps too.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, so these are all ways that we can, yeah, you know, try to have these things coexist at least better than they do now. And again, I think these things could live more in harmony than they do now, but it's a matter of us being aware of this and taking responsibility for that. So I think that's all I'll say about that. If there's any other questions that have come up,
No, but a lot of thank yous.
Okay.
And thank you for this wonderful talk. It was awesome. A lot of great information. Sorry, there was another one about thank you for the presentation. My 4 homeschool kids, ages 5 through 15, I found this very interesting.
Oh, great.
And a lot of just thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us online and in person, and the interpreters for ASL.
Oh yeah.
And of course, many thanks to Francis, our presenter. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming.